Hello and welcome to my session. My name is Candace Walkington. I'm from Southern Methodist University, and I'll be talking with you today about language in mathematics education, contextual and perceptual grounding. Following my presentation, I'll be responding to your questions in the chat space for a live Q&A. Now, let's get started. So, mathematics can be a stumbling block for pursuing many STEM careers, and these issues disproportionately impact groups underrepresented in STEM and can drive these students away from STEM fields. Algebra, in particular, has been identified as a gatekeeper in which many students struggle. Students often at this age see mathematics as disconnected from their lives and wonder, when am I ever going to use this? And issues of language are really central to these difficulties. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So my presentation is going to be about grounding. Grounding means mapping novel ideas to modality-specific experiences that are personally meaningful. And it is the process by which an agent relates mental structures to external objects. So to dig into that a little bit more, grounded representations can be understood based on everyday experience and knowledge rather than systems of explicit rules. So when we ground something, we make it more understandable. There's two types of grounding that I'm going to be talking about. The first is contextual grounding. This is the use of familiar situations from everyday experience in order to make an idea, like a math idea, more understandable. The second is perceptual grounding. This is the use of the body and perceptual motor routines or perceptual properties of real-world objects to make an idea more understandable. Contextual grounding is strongly tied to students' experiences with verbal language, whereas perceptual grounding can offer an interesting alternative to verbal language. So I'll be talking about both of these opportunities for making math more understandable. So the way that my presentation is structured, first I'm going to be talking about language in mathematics curricula, focusing on contextual grounding. Then I'm going to be focusing on gestures and body movements in mathematics, focusing on perceptual grounding. Then I'm going to close with some recommendations for considering language in mathematics learning. The question that kind of binds all of these parts together are, how can we help students make sense and make meaning of mathematics, particularly as they progress through middle and high school? So language in mathematics curricula, I'm going to be talking about symbolic versus verbal language, the cultural assumptions of mathematics curricula, their readability, and opportunities of personalizing learning. So when we look at contextual grounding in textbooks, how textbooks use real-world contexts, research has shown that students tend to perform better on verbally versus symbolically presented algebra problems, at least students who are at the K-12 level. This has led researchers to propose concreteness fading as an approach to instruction, where students first experience mathematical concepts in familiar contexts and then transition to experiencing mathematical concepts as abstractions. So we looked at a corpus of 16 Algebra 1 texts, and we found that symbols first approaches are still prevalent in textbooks. When we categorize text into conventional and investigative texts were less likely to use a symbols first approach, particularly at the beginning of the textbook, so they follow the concreteness fading better. And we defined investigative texts as texts that were based on the NCTM standards or a lot of the NSF funded texts. Investigative texts were less likely to use a verbal first approach in the initial worked examples and student activities that came before problem sets. So when we look at the cultural assumptions in math textbooks, so presenting verbal problems first can potentially be beneficial for students under concreteness fading, but what do these verbal problems tend to look like? That's another textbook study that we did. So story problems in math textbooks often look like this. It's a problem about whitewater rafting. But a really important question is, whose world do these problems represent? And this isn't just a one-off example. Whitewater rafting is weirdly prevalent as a topic in mathematics textbooks and in story problems. So this kind of led us to think about the cultural assumptions of mathematics textbooks, and we use the top-rated 7th and 8th grade textbooks from EdReports. We found that white and Asian names were overrepresented in math story problems, whereas Latin, African American, and Indigenous names were underrepresented. We found that the majority of humans depicted were of white, able-bodied humans. We found that some texts reinforce gender stereotypes and heteronormative family structures, like a man taking his girlfriend out for dinner and paying the bill. We found that most of the common real-world themes used in math textbooks involved capitalistic values like money and labor and business, and the majority of real-world activities described required either money or transportation to participate in, like a problem about renting a snowmobile or a vacation home in the Poconos. We also found that there were certain real-world themes that were used repeatedly. There were so many questions about biking, going to a carnival, reading, and hiking. So these textbooks have particular characteristics and particular cultural assumptions. But an important question is, do these actually matter for student achievement? So there's two ways to think about whether this matters. One is looking at readability, and the other is looking at match to students' interests and experiences. So I'm going to talk about readability first. Problems that are easier to read tend to benefit marginalized learners more in one of our correlational studies. And we found that problems that are harder to read may hamper marginalized students more. However, experimental studies suggest the impact is detectable but small and only affects particular students. Just to kind of say what I mean by readability characteristics here, this is a problem from one of our math curricula. And I've highlighted in yellow all of the different English language words that the student has to understand in order to be able to decode this problem. There's like this fun play on the word of dependent in the title, and then point of view is another kind of phrase that they have to be able to figure out. There's vocabulary like electricity and a knob and a dimmer switch. They have to think about a local troop and a local food pantry. So there's lots, and just in this short little snippet, there's lots of different readability issues going on. We've also looked at contextual visuals in some of our research. Other research has suggested that English learners may benefit more than non-English learners when information is communicated through visuals. Finally, personalized learning suggests that customizing problems to students' interests may reduce the negative effects of readability. So students have an easier time reading about things that they're familiar with and interested in. So the final topic under language and math curricula that I'm going to talk about is personalized learning. This is all about connecting math concepts to students' interests. So students often use math when engaging with their interests, such as social media, playing video games, or doing a variety of other everyday activities. And I'm going to show two very short examples of this. The first one's about social media. And she's talking about how she uses math when she is on Instagram.
That's mostly just like sharing like pictures of like whatever you're doing. So you can like have posts and follow you, you can follow people and accounts you like. And if you put like hashtags, like sometimes you can get like a whole bunch of likes. And there's like Instagram names, people have like 25K followers. There's a bunch of hashtags, so I get anywhere from 30 to 50, 60.
So she's talking about how her number of likes is related to her number of hashtags. Here's a similar snippet about playing video games.
Destiny Exchange get a weapon like 3 or 500. Like 1 out of 100, but there's a thing that gets you to like 1 out of 10. The chance of getting a legendary player is, oh my god. In FIFA and FIFA, the chance of getting a player over 90% shooting is like 1 in a million.
So these are both examples of how students use mathematics in their everyday lives. So some of the studies we've conducted, we found that personalization can improve students' performance, efficiency, and transfer in Algebra 1, And we did a very simple version of personalization. We made modifications to the problems like the ones you see in the table. In a second study, we found that personalization improves interest in math, and over time, this promotes learning on paper-based tests. And then in a third study, we found that students receiving personalization are less likely to game the system and have more instances of positive affective states and fewer instances of negative affective states. However, these studies are not representative of what the body of work on personalization's effect on learning shows. We ourselves have conducted quite a few studies that have found no effect on personalized learning. And we recently conducted a study that found some positive effects and also some negative effects, which I'm going to talk about. So we became interested looking at this body of literature on what design factors distinguish the successful studies in personalizing problem contexts in math curricula. So the first is depth, whether the problems are relevant to students' lives, communities, and culture. The second is grain size, or whether it's adaptive based on individual experience. And the third is ownership, whether students can make meaningful decisions about their learning and drive instruction. So in our most recent study, we really tried to have students take ownership of the personalized connections to promote agency and make the connections rich and valid. So we had students pose problems based on popular culture or career interest with scaffolds. And this was an RCT of 451 students at 3 age levels. We measured their interest in math and their math learning. And we found for when students posed problems about careers they were interested in, it was beneficial for algebra learning outcomes, but harmful for math interest outcomes for students receiving low dosage. When students posed problems about their popular culture interests, we found it was beneficial for algebra learning outcomes, especially for college students, but harmful for math interest outcomes for middle and high school students. And we think we got these kind of negative affect outcomes because posing problems was very challenging for students, even with a lot of support, and that may lead to some negative affect. And some students were not accustomed to the interactive and collaborative nature of the activities they were doing in their math class to pose personalized problems. So I've talked about contextual grounding. Now I'm going to move to talk about perceptual grounding, which is another way that math can be grounded in students' experiences through perceptual motor integration. So when we think about gestures in the mathematics classroom and their potential, this relies on the idea that mathematical reasoning is embodied. It's tied to perception, action, and spatial systems, and physical motions like gestures. So I'm going to show an example of this. This is two students coming up with a justification for the mathematical conjecture, diagonals of a rectangle are always congruent. And I don't want you to focus so much on what is said. I want you to pay attention as you watch this video to the students' gestures as they're coming up with a justification.
Okay, so the length is going to stay the same because, like, if you think of it, the length is changing. It's more the direction is changing, you know? So, yes, you're going to have to say.
So students intuitively understand math in a spatial and embodied way, and they spontaneously use gestures and movements to explore concepts. Typical classroom instruction does not always lend itself to or value these embodied ways that students have of expressing themselves or capitalize on opportunities related to perceptual grounding. So we define gestures as spontaneous or purposeful arm and hand movements produced when thinking or communicating, and gestures can exhibit mental simulations of actions, perceptions, and conceptual metaphors. So to unpack the sequence we just saw in the video, what we see here is a really complex exchange of mathematical ideas using gesture, where verbal language takes on a lesser role. So as this student on the left is speaking, we see the student on the right start making this rectangular gesture. The speaker, the student on the left, then copies this rectangular gesture and then adds on a diagonal gesture while looking at the gesturing student on the right. So then the student on the right pauses his rectangular gesture, and then he copies the diagonal gesture that the first student had proposed. So they're exchanging ideas there, even though the student on the right never speaks during this exchange. So this also led us to observe that collaboration lends itself to unique forms of gesturing and embodied learning. So one of the theories that we rely on here is a theory of cognition action transduction. Typically, we think that your thoughts cause your actions. You think about moving your arm, so you move your arm. But cognition action transduction recognizes that your actions can also cause novel thoughts, novel ideas, including novel mathematical learning. So there's various studies that have tested cognition action transduction, where students are instructed to make different movements, and then it's observed whether they learn purely from making those movements. And there's been some support for this in these research studies. And this kind of lends itself to the idea from enactivist research that learning is moving in new ways, that learning to gesture a mathematical concept is a form of learning that mathematical concept, even if you can't verbalize it. So we've done several studies looking at these ideas. In the first one, we inhibited students' gestures while having them wear oven mitts and clasp water bottles. And it was a study of 120 students. And we basically found that inhibiting their gestures didn't actually affect their outcomes in any way. We looked at a bunch of things, and it did significantly reduce their tendency to gesture, but that's about it. However, we did see that when students had the oven mitts and the water bottles, they would make like micro gestures. They would gesture like inside the gloves or with their heads or with their feet even. So they definitely were not easily prevented from gesturing, and there might have been more gestures that we weren't able to detect. In a second study, we had high school students perform arm motions that were either relevant to a mathematical conjecture, like they would make the diagonals of the rectangle with their arms, or matched motions that were not relevant for that particular conjecture. And we found a moderation effect. So for students who tended to be gesturers, doing these directed motions were effective for their learning. And we didn't tell them that the directed motions were related to the conjectures. But as you can see from the histogram, overall, there were no overall effects of directing the motions. It was just the moderation effect for the group of gesturers. The directed motions were effective. However, one thing we noted in this study is that the reasoning students engaged in could be richer. So we started to look towards collaboration. After we started seeing things like the video I introduced this section with, we became really interested in how students embody ideas together. So we started studying collaborative gestures, which are gestures that are physically taken up by multiple learners and that hold a meaning that is explicitly dependent on the gestures of interactional partners. And these gestures can show how mathematical ideas become distributed over different learners as they engage in group-level cognitive processing. And we started coordinating different gesture moves, like we had collaborative gestures where students would echo each other's gestures or they would mirror each other's gestures. And these tended to co-occur with different talk moves when they were, for instance, planning what they were going to do, when they were exploring, or where they were representing a mathematical idea. We also found an association that when students made collaborative gestures, they often tended to have better performance on the math problems. So we were interested in testing this kind of correlational relationship in an environment where we could induce collaborative gestures. So we designed a game, The Hidden Village, which was a motion capture game for secondary geometry. It tracks skeletons, body, and hand in real time. It instructs learners to perform directed movements to spur future gestures and actions. And over here, you can see an interface where teachers and students can create their own movements to go with different mathematical tasks. So this is like an embodied open source textbook where mathematical definitions and concepts can be paired with motions that are created by students and teachers. So we did a study of 6 intact geometry classes who played The Hidden Village and created poses to go with conjectures in a unit on quadrilaterals they were studying. And we found that students performed significantly better at post on conjectures that they had created motions for versus conjectures that another group had created motions for. We found that students engaged in rich multimodal conversations when they were creating the poses that led to mathematical insights about quadrilaterals, and that involved a lot of collaborative gestures. We also found in this study that much of students' knowledge was expressed via gesture alone, and that terminology, mathematical terminology, was a significant barrier to students' reasoning that they chose to navigate via gestures when they were in a collaborative setting. Our research and other research has also suggested that this kind of gesturing may be particularly important for English learners. So the final study I'm going to talk about when thinking about perceptual grounding is a study we did in virtual reality of math tutoring. So math tutoring has become really important in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a lot of kind of tutoring interventions going on right now. And we designed one for virtual reality with theories of embodied cognition kind of at the forefront. So our initial study was of 38 middle school students from racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically minoritized backgrounds, and the majority of our participants were English learners. They engaged in 7 VR sessions where they were put in groups of 1 to 3 students, and they had a trained undergraduate university tutor. The sessions focused on creating and communicating through hand gestures and on immersive interactions with dynamical mathematical objects. We specifically partnered with GeoGebra to create the dynamic math objects. And looking at across these sessions, we found many kinds of rich and embodied mathematical interactions that would not have been possible in a typical online tutoring or in face-to-face tutoring. And we found the treatment significantly outperformed the control in pre-post differences, both on the curriculum math test and on the standardized math test. But 2 important caveats to this. We found there were still lots of technical problems with getting the VR to work well on a school internet, and we had a weak control group for this study. Our control group received other kinds of activities in VR that weren't mathematics. So some recommendations coming out of this research. So students intuitively use mathematical principles as they engage with their interests and as they use their bodies to reason and communicate. So this offers important opportunities for grounding, for ways to connect mathematical concepts to things these students understand and are familiar with in order to support their learning. So when we're thinking about how to ground mathematical language in familiar contexts, it's important to pay attention to how and when curricular materials contextualize mathematical ideas. The relationship between language use in math tasks and students' performance is definitely complex, but there is ample evidence that familiarity and readability can matter, and that contextual grounding can make math more accessible. Interest-based connections between mathematics and students' interests can be powerful when they're done well, but they're still difficult to implement in practice. And when we're thinking about grounding mathematical language in perceptual routines like directed actions and gestures, we found that having students engage in gesture creation, where they make their own gestures to correspond to ideas, is feasible and effective. We've also found that collaborative forms of gesture seem to be especially powerful. That gesture can help students negotiate and overcome issues with mathematical terminology. And we found that VR-based tutoring offers unique affordances for gesture compared to screen-based tutoring, and unique affordances for interacting with immersive dynamic mathematical objects compared to in-person tutoring, but is probably not yet ready for widespread implementation. I'd like to acknowledge my amazing collaborators on each of these projects. And I'd also like to acknowledge my funding sources, the U.S. Department of Education, as well as the National Science Foundation. You can follow me on Twitter, and here is my email address. And now we can transition into questions and discussion. Thank you so much. Awesome, and I already see a question. Perfect. So I think there's about a 25-second delay, just so y'all know, if you are wondering why I'm a little behind where y'all are with typing stuff in. Okay. So Lauren asked, can you expand more on interest-based connections done well versus not? Yeah, so there's been a lot of studies on this. And the results of them has been really mixed in terms of studies that have found significant gains and studies that have done like a ton of work creating interest-based materials, a ton of work training teachers to use them, and then ultimately not found any effects. So there's kind of two classes of studies that I would say have been ineffective. One is when you connect math to students' interests in a really shallow way. Often this is actually done without ever talking to the students. You know, somebody just looks at a problem, thinks of, okay, how could I make this about basketball? Or how could I make this about eating out? Like, I know, the kinds of things that students like to do. And this is, kind of the easiest development wise. And you don't need to engage with the population. And I think, in some of the older studies, 20 or 30 years ago, there was some evidence that this kind of interest-based connections would lead to learning gains. But there's been a lot of studies since that have shown that this kind of shallow personalization, this shallow way of connecting to students' interests is not going to work super well, and you're probably not going to get good outcomes from it. So a lot of our research tries to make deeper connections to students' interests by working with students, working with teachers, and even working with community members. And because we saw how effective that could be, we kept kind of like revving it up until maybe we went a little bit too far in our last study, where we really put it on students to generate the connections between mathematics and the things they were interested in. So that was kind of like the other side of the extreme. It was quite authentic, but it was just so difficult for students to do that it seemed to compromise some of their affective outcomes, some of their attitudes towards mathematics, even though the difficulty of the task did seem to enhance their learning. So the idea is to find that kind of nice middle ground where the connections you're making to students' interests are authentic, where students have a role, where teachers have a role, where it's embedded in kind of their community and their practices, but to be really careful that you're providing the appropriate supports and that, students are able to engage in it without too much, like a excessive amount of struggle. Some struggle is obviously good. Yeah, follow-up questions or other questions y'all have? I will probably just start spitballing, talking about stuff, but I hope I get some more questions. So one thing that we've been thinking about, okay, awesome. Yes, I will definitely send you the slides. I'm saving your email right now. Got it. Okay. So one thing that we've been thinking about since I recorded this video, in terms of like the last question, and please interrupt me with other questions if y'all have other questions, but I'll just talk about something, is using AI to kind of help this process of connecting math to students' interests. Because, the way we did it in that last study, it was just too difficult for students, but AI is actually like really, really good at taking the burden off of students for stuff like generating scenarios, imaginary scenarios where math might be used that are connected to the real world. So we did a study this summer where we had students work with AI to create math problems about their interests. They would create the problems using just the typical chat GPT. They would illustrate the problems using DALL-E 2. And that seemed to work better. We didn't take learning outcomes from that study. It was a very like exploratory, looking at what the possibilities were. But I think that, the face of what personalization looks like, of what like connecting to students' interests looks like is never going to be the same again. We're never going to do it the way we used to do it with the advent of generative AI, because it doesn't make sense to not use AI for the purpose of connecting to students' interests. It can just be so much more efficient in doing that than humans ever could. Humans definitely need to be in the loop, but I don't see methods that don't use AI being used like 5 years from now. So that's one thing I'm interested in and excited to talk more about. So I'll do another call. Any questions? And then I can keep talking about other stuff that we've done. So in terms of embodied learning, one thing that we've been working a lot on since I filmed this is students interacting with holograms in embodied ways. So like using augmented reality headsets. We also have a AR thing that works through tablets, where you hold up the camera of the tablet and it projects a hologram in the environment. And I think that's another area that's really going to transform the way that we teach math over the next, 5 to 10 years, maybe for AR. It's not quite at the implementation level anymore. But we have been doing some studies that suggest for math that involves three-dimensional objects, particularly like geometry, where students have to think in 3 dimensions, that AR and VR can be effective for their learning in experimental studies. So, and we hypothesize one of the main reasons that it's effective is because of the way they can like gesture and like interact dynamically with a hologram that you can't really do with like a flat piece of paper or a flat screen. Like, if it's a hologram of something 3-dimensional, you can walk around it, you can like reach in it, you can even like make it so big that you're inside of it. There's all sorts of really interesting embodied interactions that you can have with virtual objects in 3 dimensions that are impossible in a regular classroom, or just like in the real world. It's like this new hybrid world where you can put these imaginary objects in it. So I think that is another way that we're going to be grounding things in brand new ways in the near future. So, all right, call for questions. Talk about personalization, textbooks, gestures, movements. Well, if you want any resources from today, including the slides, I'm happy to send those to you. All of the projects I kind of showed on that last slide have websites. And like the way that we do our research, some of it is more like basic research where it's not classroom ready yet. We're just trying to discover things about how humans think and learn that can feed into future designs for technologies and for curricula. And some of it is like kind of more focused on being classroom ready, like our VR tutoring thing, like that was, intended to be implemented with students at scale. So, the kinds of like resources we have are based on that. And like also the accessibility of the things that we create. All of it is intended to be distributed for free. We don't charge for anything. But some of it is definitely not at the point where we're ready to distribute it yet. We do have an app called Math Finder, which I guess I didn't talk about in the presentation. I can spitball a little bit about that. It's an app and it uses augmented reality tools, and you use it to travel around. It can be used anywhere, but we have like some specific curated portions of it for different places in Dallas-Fort Worth where I live. And you make observations about your surroundings that are mathematical. You ask questions. And then there's various AR tools that you can use in Math Finder to find the math. Like we have AR tools for like measuring the distance or measuring angles, and it all happens like through the camera feed. There's one for counting. We have some that like let you calculate area or just like layer different holograms over a real world scene in your camera feed so that you can mathematize it in interesting ways. And we're doing experiments about using Math Finder in informal learning settings. So using it with kids in grades 4 through 10 to have them make observations and ask questions about their surroundings and see that math is all around them. And we're partnering with a lot of different informal learning organizations. So if you're interested more about that, we have tons of resources related to this Math Finder project as well. And it kind of Math Finder is kind of both personalized and embodied because it connects to students' communities and their local surroundings. So it has this really interesting connection to their interests. And then it's embodied because it's all about them being in the physical places where they are, and interacting with those places in new embodied ways by moving around those places, by measuring and mathematizing those places in different ways as well. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. And please do follow up with me if you have any questions or if there's anything you want to chat about.